Or yeah, good.
Should we start? Because I will make a small introduction and introduce the speakers. So even if people, well, this is not the most interesting part of our discussion, so you can then let people in as they come, and they will still make it for our introductory key speakers to hear their presentations. So if you agree, I will start. Hello, I'm Vesna Pusić, the one who wrote to you and send you all the emails. Thank you for joining. This is our first debate of this year, and it will be, as you know, on foreign, EU, and regional policy of the Italian government of Giorgia Meloni. I want to use this opportunity to thank the Italian ambassador to Croatia, His Excellency Pier Francesco Sacco, who really helped us put together this excellent and exciting group of speakers that you will hear tonight. On Monday, February 20th, American President Biden paid surprise visits to Kiev. On Tuesday, February 21st, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni paid, in some ways, also a surprising visit to Kiev, not because we didn't know about it, since we did know that she was going to go, because she said she was going to go before the first anniversary of the latest aggression on Ukraine, but because when she was elected 6 months ago, that was one of the key concerns, let's say, of the people within the European Union, but also in NATO and globally. How will the new Italian government treat the war in Ukraine? And the European and NATO, let's say, agreement or consensus on the policies, or near consensus, let's say, on the policies both towards Ukraine and Russia, especially since the government coalition, Meloni government coalition, is made up also of Liga, led by Matteo Salvini, whom we remember in Poland with a big Vladimir Putin shirt, trying to give a speech, and Silvio Berlusconi, who is a personal friend of Vladimir Putin. So this was one of the key concerns, and a lot of people thought that Meloni might become a stronger, or turn out to be a stronger version of Marine Le Pen, the French politician who, as you all remember, in the European Parliament, they called Mrs. Putin. However, it seems that we were all wrong. And some Italian colleagues actually did point out that we might be wrong, or worrying in the wrong direction, let's say, and that in that sense, the Meloni government will not change these policies. Tonight, to answer a lot of our questions, but also give us introductory talks to our topic on the foreign, regional, and European Union policies, and especially possible differences between, let's say, global or NATO policies on one hand and European Union policies of the Meloni government. Our Professor Stefano Bianchini of the University of Bologna, Department of Political and Social Sciences. Everybody in this region definitely have known about him for many years. He is, among other things, a specialist in Eastern European politics and history, in former Yugoslavia, Western Balkans, published many, many books, edited many books, many articles, is the editor-in-chief of a series on Balkan and East Central Europe. An all-around public intellectual, and certainly very well known, much wider than Italy, and I would say as well known in the Western Balkans and all of this region as he is in Italy. Our second speaker is Dr. Antonio Villafranca from the Italian Institute for International Political Studies in Milan. He is an economist by training, lecturer in international relations at Bocconi University in Milan. He specializes both in economic EU-Italian relations, but also in international relations and monetary policy, as well as the future of European Union in the age of nationalism. And our third speaker is Dr. Leo Goretti of the Institute for International Affairs in Rome. He is a historian by training, editor of publications of his institute, published on a wide range of issues, from the war in Ukraine to the transition between Draghi and Meloni governments, to the future of democratic monarchies in Europe, which I thought particularly intriguing, a book called Crowns of Europe. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you to all the participants who have joined us tonight. And I will now give the floor to Professor Bianchini.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pusić. Thank you, Vesna, for your kind presentation. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Well, I will start my contribution focusing particularly on the Balkans. And there is a reason why, because it seems to me that this region has been a little bit in some way forgotten because of the war in Ukraine and other issues previously, let's say, for instance, the pandemic or the migration flows. All these issues marginalized in some way within the framework of the European Union, the role of this region that is waiting since 2003. The Thessaloniki summit, the possibility to be integrated into the European Union, because this has been promised to the whole region. And well, speaking about the Italian government within this framework, we can see in some way a set of continuity, which has been in some way confirmed, at least from the first steps of the Meloni government, in the sense that the conference in Trieste last January 24, which was the first event organized by the government about the Balkans, was mainly focused on the idea how Italy can be more active in the region by increasing the investments. It was mainly a meeting with entrepreneurs and banks, but it was connected to some traditional, let's say, concern in the traditional of stability, the need to protect and preserve and develop the stability in the region, to encourage the integration of the European, within the European Union, of the candidate and potential candidate countries of the region. And in some way, this was already anticipated by one diplomatic activity by Minister Tajani e Crovetto to Serbian Montenegro, to Serbian, sorry, in Kosovo last November 22, where they tried to join other international visits in Belgrade and Pristina in order to convince the two leaders to sign and to accept the Franco-German proposal of mediation that should lead to an informal mutual recognition between the two sides. From this point of view, I said that there is some sort of confirmation of a traditional set of goals of the Italian government. This is true with up and downs, because Italy follow the events with moments of great attentions, and others moments where Italy partially disappear from the scene. I would like just to remind very quickly the fact that after a period of cooperation in the region, the so-called cleansed hands, mani pulite, forced Italy to concentrate more on domestic issues. The same occurred after the economic crisis of 2007 and 2008, when lots of laws that were supporting regional cooperation in the Balkans were drying without any money. So this is or if I can say also very critically, the government, Draghi's government, was, to my great surprise, participated actively to the inclusion in the meeting of June of the last year, in the inclusion of Ukraine among the candidate countries after a very quick analysis of the questionnaires, when such a treatment was never given for the other Balkan countries, and particularly Draghi didn't ask to recognize the status of candidate countries for Bosnia and Herzegovina. This was a surprise to me, but in this sense also, so this is just to explain that there is some sort of continuity with ups and downs, and the government of Meloni seems to me that for the moment is included in this trend. I will explain why, because the conference in Trieste, for instance, the first steps that have been made by these governments forgot to make an emphasis to a very important issue, in my view, that is the macro-regional cooperation. The macro-regional cooperation that has been launched by the Italian governments. I would like to remind the role of Minister De Michelis in 1989, when he launched the famous quadrilateral, then now Central European Initiative, which includes, by the way, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldavia, and or the Adriatic-Ionian Initiative, which has been later supported by the European Commission with the program of USR, which, as you know, is working and promoting programs that are connected to connectivities, blue economy, environmental issues, and cultural tourism. All these aspects, however, have been not considered, or not so much considered by the state, despite of the fact that, in my view, this is a crucial point because it emphasizes the territorial cooperation. This is an opportunity, a great opportunity, the macro-regional policy, because it is pushing in some way the cooperation from below. The fact that one region, one Italian region, the region Emilia-Romagna, is the managing authority of Adrian, of the Interreg regional program, is very important because it offers the opportunity to whom? To municipalities, to regions, to territorial units, and even to universities to cooperate from below and to organize projects, to cooperate, to act in some way by implementing a sort of soft diplomacy. And this is something that is very important, particularly in the area where politics has so difficulties to speak. I mean, for instance, considering the events that are dividing Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia and Kosovo, and even Macedonia. This is also important because there is a lack of credibility, an increasing lack of credibility by the European Commission in the region. Just to remind, one of the key points that is coming to my mind is exactly the future of North Macedonia. Macedonia has been for 20 years invited to change his name or to find a solution with Greece, and then immediately the wave will be paved to join the European Union. Well, as soon as Macedonia came to make an agreement with Greece, Bulgaria came with additional problems. So this is something that in some way decrease the credibility of the European Union in the region, and this is very dangerous. Very dangerous because lots of issues are still open issues, and from on the other side there is a possibility of settling, or at least to put down, to reduce the tensions by by reinforcing the territorial cooperation. And it seems to me that this is a very crucial point for the foreign policy of Italy. And we are, in this sense, waiting to see whether the government, the Meloni government, will make a change from this point of view, not only in terms of relation towards the Balkans, but also in terms of insisting within the framework of the European Union to settle issues, open issues, because we know that there are huge problems in the region. There is not only a question of related of, let's say, cooperation because of the environmental issues or because of cultural tourism. These are important issues, but we know that the key issues are related to the unemployment, to immigration, for instance, the Balkan route, the demographic decline, the brain drain, all these issues that run the risk to make the Balkans an empty box for certain reasons. So I think that in this sense, the efforts that are made on the low level is very important, and this should be understood not only by the Italian government, but also by the governments of the region, because I have the impression that even the governments in the region underestimate the role of the territorial cooperation. And this is a very crucial point, because in some way it is the only way when we can raise the issue of cooperation, simply because, let's say, one important point, like for instance, waste is settled by common strategies between municipalities, regions, with the support of faculties and experts, and they can in some way reduce the tensions that still remain at the political level. And this is very important, particularly in this moment when the tensions, the political tension in Europe are growing up because of the Ukrainian war and the invasion, the Russian invasion to Ukraine. All these aspects that create confrontations and tensions have a reflection into the region. We know in Bosnia, in Montenegro, in Serbia and Kosovo, even in Albania for other reasons. We know the tensions, the political tensions that are dividing the country. So for this reason, it seems to me that a turn should be expected by the governments in the region and by the Italian government. To what extent the Italian government will be ready to do this or to encourage its own partners within the European Union and in the region, this is something that remains to be seen. Difficult to predict for the moment. Also because we have a coalition of governments, and Meloni also has the task to consider also the role of the other two parties, the League, the Northern League, and the Berlusconi's parties, who are more, let's say, cautious about, for instance, the sending weapons to Ukraine. And in this case, this is something that remain relevant in the framework of a complex of the European Union, where the solidarity and the idea of a bloc that is strong, offering a strong image of cooperation is actually more an image rather than a reality, because there are lots of problems from the economic point of view to the migration point of view, the distribution of the migrants, the question of the borders of the European Union. So lots of issues that divide deeply the European Union and creates also problems between some member states. I'm particularly in mind the very active actions of Poland in comparison to Germany and France in this moment, considering also that Poland is trying to taking a leading role within the European Union with the support of the United States, while France and Germany are appearing to go marginalized or to take down their own positions. In my view, also because it was a great issue for the future of, and I conclude this, for the future of the European resettlement and or peace reconstruction, the fact that both Merkel and Hollande last December confirmed that the Minsk agreement will be signed in order to allow Ukraine to take time and to be prepared for a war in military terms. So this is something that creates conditions for lack of trust between the sides and makes even more complicated the issue of a negotiation of a peace in the future. And well, we'll see which kind of role the Meloni government will be able to play in this context behind her personal intentions, because this is something that is connected to the coalition, to the polls in Italy, but also the relations of this government with the other governments of the European Union and with the European Commission and the EU as such. Thank you for your attention.
I thank you very much, Professor Bianchini. We will now go to Dr. Villafranca, who is going to emphasize the economic relations and sort of constellation, and especially in the relation to the European Union. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. And you said it perfectly. I mean, there's no way we can really understand the trajectory of the Italian economy without, including it in the EU trajectory and what the EU has been doing over the last couple of years when it comes to monetary and economic policy. So let me share the screen with you. Should be this one. Okay, I hope you see it.
Just a moment. Yeah, we do.
Just 1 second, I have to move it here. All right. So let me start from this. If we really want to understand what is happening to the Italian economy and what is going to happen also to the European economy, we have to start from just before the COVID-19. And then see how the Ukraine war also impacted on economic prospects. Because let's be very frank on this. I usually, when I talk about it, I use a fairy tale, which is the Sleeping Beauty. I mean, in 2019, before the COVID-19, the European Union was a Sleeping Beauty. This is the English title of this fairy tale. But in Italian, in the Italian translation, we had something else. It is the Bella Addormentata, the Sleeping Beauty, nel bosco, in the woods. We also put the woods in the context. And the reason is that, what is the woods? I mean, the woods was an international context which was increasingly more complicated, more fragmented, in which the European Union basically was really losing sight of what role the European Union could play in the international context. Then Prince Charming, a very ugly Prince Charming, arrived with the face of a virus, and all of a sudden the European Union finally went back to life with unprecedented measures. It's incredible. From strictly the economic point of view, what the European Union did right before the COVID-19 epidemic and then pandemic is impressive. I would never expect something like this in just a matter of months or even weeks. Just to scroll down the first slide, we suspended the Stability and Growth Pact, which is still suspended, but until the end of this year. And this is important because the European Commission already made a proposal to reform the Stability and Growth Pact, which has some strong points, but also a lot of drawbacks, especially from the point of view of Italy, especially the thing that in this proposal made by the European Commission, there is a distinction to be made among European member states in what we call in Italy Serie A, B, and C. So the Premier League and then other leagues according to the debt to GDP ratio. So of course, by definition, Italy is in the Serie C, is in the worst league. This is not a good news because you send a crystal clear signal to international markets, meaning that there is an endogenous fragility in the Italian economy, which is true, which is public debt. Of course, there is no hiding. Still, I mean, I don't think that it is wise to send this message to the to international markets. So, but just to scroll it down, Stability and Growth Pact suspended, then impressive action made by the European Central Bank. Maybe Italians don't really feel it, but it's incredible. Not only, of course, the policy which was made by the European Central Bank in terms of interest rates, which was already at zero, so you could not do more than that. Actually, it was also in negative territory, so it was really impressive. but the ECB bought a lot of Italian bonds, also in a way which was not precisely as agreed in the European context, because we should follow the so-called capital key when it comes to the assets that the European Central Bank can buy from states. And this capital key, which is the rule to be used in how many, for instance, Italian bonds the ECB can buy against, German bonds, French bonds, and so on, basically should be done according to the contribution of each state to the capital of the ECB, which is quite proportional to the GDP of each country. Well, the ECB did bought more Italian bonds than possible according to the capital key. So basically, they supported a lot. And this is also the reason why, despite the huge increase in the Italian public debt from about 134 debt to GDP ratio, 134% to about 150%. But the spread, the 10 years bond, or the Italian 10 years bonds and the German 10 years bond, basically is always, it's almost stable at around 200 basic points, 2%, the difference between the Italian bonds and the German bonds in 10-year bonds. So, and this, the reason behind, the rationale behind that is basically that the ECB is buying proportionally more Italian bonds. Well, this program was concluded a few months ago, but it's still true that anytime there is, a deadline for, each Italian bond reaches its maturity, the ECB is ready to buy if there is not a big demand from the market. So that's why, despite all the mess and despite the huge Italian debt, the spread is relatively low. And then other measures, sure, and the ESM, there is no need to talk about it, but most of all, Next Generation EU, a common debt. This is really an unprecedented measure. It was anything but, you could not take it for granted, for sure. In this case, the so-called Franco-German axis worked very, very well, because they paved the way to reach a consensus, an agreement in the European Union to have a common debt. And this common debt, whose main focus is on investment for green, mostly for green and digital transition, now is, these investments are paying back in terms of growth. So a part of the Italian growth, a big chunk of it, is related, of course, to the Next Generation EU. But to sum up on these measures, when we say that we suspended the Stability and Growth Pact, so you can spend, spend, spend. When we say that the European Central Bank kept the interest rate at zero, basically, or in a negative territory, and when we say that you can spend more also for investment, basically it means that we, for some years, we had a very, very expansionary fiscal and monetary policy in the European Union and in the United States, and basically in all the other states who could afford to spend, 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 and which had a very strong central bank. The United Kingdom thought that they had a central bank which was as powerful as the Fed and the ECB. Then the markets knocked on the British door and said, you know what, it's not like this. You can. And then a prime minister also realized that it was also time to resign. But of course, these kind of decisions, when they are wrong decision, of course, they have an impact. But basically, all this means very expansionary fiscal policy, very expansionary monetary policy. Any handbook of economics would say that if all the other things being equal, if you have expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary monetary policy, you have, of course, debt increased everywhere in the world and in the European Union. I already mentioned Italy. but there is also France, whose debt to GDP is now over 100%. It's about 113%. Even Germany, which is quite striking, which before COVID was below 60%, now is very close to 70%. So, I mean, there is a big increase in debt, because if you spend, of course, you are borrowing this money, you're not producing this money. So, of course, there is debt. And the other thing which is quite striking to everybody is inflation. But inflation does not come out of nothing. I mean, inflation comes out of very expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. Now you see in this graph the inflation rate both in the United States and in the European Union. You see that at the beginning, I mean, the increase, the surge of inflation was much higher in the United States. Then, you know, inflation in the European Union catched up with the inflation in the United States and overcame the inflation in the United States. But what is even more important than this is this graph. Don't be scared of it. This is the so-called core inflation in the United States and in the Eurozone. What is the core inflation? You take the inflation, the rise of prices of all products, and you subtract from the inflation, the overall inflation, energy and food. Why do you subtract energy and food? Because this inflation is not really the product of decisions made by states or by the European Union or by the ECB. Maybe it's possibly it is an imported inflation. Take energy. I mean, we don't have to raise interest rates in the European Union because, you know, oil and gas prices are going up. It doesn't make any sense because there is nothing we can do about it, you know, because of what we know about the Ukraine war and so on. So that's why, I mean, we have to have a look at the core inflation, just, you know, taking out energy and food. And you see that in the United States, at the beginning, core inflation was very high. Basically, it means that prices were on the rise in the United States because people were spending a lot of money, households and, you know, private citizens, individuals. They were spending a lot of money. They were also spending all the subsidies they got from the government during the pandemic. So at the beginning, the US core inflation was very high. Now it's going down. That's why Fed now is reconsidering its monetary policy, and they said, yes, maybe we'll, you know, still raise interest rate for a while, but now, I mean, not so much. When it comes to the European Union, the core inflation is still relatively high. That's why the European Central Bank is, you know, quite careful and say, no, let's take a moment and think. Maybe we still have to raise interest rate because the core inflation is still relatively high. So this is something that we can expect also for 2013. So the bottom line in terms of growth is this one. These are the latest figures produced, especially the ones on the right by the European Commission. For Italy, the growth in 2023 is expecting to be 0.8%. And it is impressive because just at the end of 2022, Italy's growth was supposed to be 0 or even negative. So in a few weeks, you know, all the forecasts, you know, completely changed. That's why, and then I'm concluding. That's why I always say don't trust economists because, you know, all the econometric, you know, models, they are not working. So the bottom line of all this is that for 2023, the Italian economy will hold, is doing relatively well. So if rationality, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to the war, holds, also the Italian economy should hold in 2023. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you can just close the presentation so I can see everybody.
Doing it. Second, I have to send out to do it.
Very exciting points.
Yeah.
As you know, for our side of the Adriatic, it really is important that the Italian economy holds. Especially Croatia, since our banks are your banks.
Okay. Now it's okay. You still have my presentation?
I still have the presentation, yes.
Okay, okay, so I have to push. Okay.
This is okay. Thank you very much. And we will now go.
You're muted.
So thank you very much. There are a lot of very exciting points, and as you know, for us, it's extremely important that the Italian economy holds because it reflects very much on our economies. We now go to Dr. Goretti. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pusić, for the invitation. And yeah, unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about the future of democratic monarchies today, but rather on Italy's foreign policy. We just published at IAI our yearly report on Italy's foreign policy, of which we also published an executive summary in English that I'm going to share via our chat after my presentation, because I think it may be of some interest. But I will try to frame what we found out in our report in a longer term perspective, because I'm a historian, but because I also think that it helps answer some of the questions that were addressed at the beginning. If we look at Italy's foreign policy in a long-term perspective, since 1945, there are three pillars, according to a long-standing interpretation, around which it has been revolving, which are the transatlantic one, which is mainly related to guaranteeing the security of the country, especially in the Cold War period. There is the European pillar, which is the one linked on the one hand to political integration at the supranational level, on the other hand to the economic and social development of the country. And then there is the Mediterranean pillar, which is where, especially throughout the Cold War, Italy's foreign policy had a bit more of leeway compared to the other two in terms of its action. And broadly speaking, this sort of dynamic also held true after 1989, possibly with some sort of shades when it came to the alternation between center-left and center-right governments, where center-left governments possibly focused a bit more on the European pillar and European integration. Center-right governments were more focusing on strengthening transatlantic relations. This held till, I would say, the early 2010s. Then in the second half of the 2010s, for some reasons, both internationally and domestically, it looked like this dynamic was somehow in crisis. I'm thinking especially at what happened after 2016 with Trump as a sort of an eccentric, so to speak, exceptional in many ways US president, fears of a possible disengagement of the US from European security and NATO, talks about burden sharing. And as far as the European pillar goes, mounting Euroscepticism also in Europe, but especially in Italy as a result of the migration crisis and the rise of Eurosceptic political parties. And the moment perhaps which best exemplifies how Italy's foreign policy in this phase was looking for new directions compared with the past was in March 2019, when Italy was the first and only G7 country to sign a memorandum of understanding with China on the Belt and Road Initiative, which created huge concerns in the US and among European allies, and really seemed to be like a different trajectory to what had been in the past. Now, I would say that this sort of uncertainty about where Italy's foreign policy was going somehow was turned upside down in the early 2020s because of the two crises that hit Italy and Europe in those years. The first one is obviously the COVID pandemic, and I think that Antonio Villafranca's presentation explained it very well, why the response that was kind of put forward at the EU level to the pandemic somehow brought the EU pillar back to the center of Italy's foreign policy. True, at the very beginning of the pandemic, in the very early weeks, there were talks about disappointment about the EU response. There was this attempt at masked diplomacy by both China and Russia, which incidentally Vladimir Putin also briefly mentioned in his speech in the last few days. But overall, when actually the response from the UK came, and Next Generation EU especially was drafted, then it became clear that for Italy to be able to address the post-crisis phase, it was crucial to be firmly entrenched within the European project. And this is something which has to be borne in mind also looking at what the present government is doing. So that was somehow a game changer. And obviously the second crisis, which somehow brought back to the center the other pillar, which is the transatlantic one, was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which made it clear that in terms of security for Europe, but for Italy too, the transatlantic alliance is still central. Obviously, there are questions about how viable this is going to be in the long term, especially given the renewed attention, the new attention actually in the US for the Indo-Pacific, but at the moment, due to the war in Ukraine, this sort of centrality of NATO especially is not going to be put into question in the country. And obviously the Draghi government between 2021 and 2022 was perhaps the prime example of how Italy's foreign policy was going back on the more traditional tracks, a government which was able to play a sort of protagonist role in Europe and beyond, thanks to the prestige of the prime minister, obviously, and which was able at the EU level to really kind of have the role of a driver on several sort of issues, such as the discussions about the revision of the Stability and Growth Pact, the discussion about introducing a qualified majority rule in fiscal and foreign policy, the cap on gas prices, which was eventually introduced after Draghi had resigned, but Draghi had a role definitely to kickstart the debate around it. And again, as was mentioned before also by Professor Bianchini, in kind of creating this push for granting candidate country status to Ukraine and Moldova in June, with the trip to Kiev, which Draghi did along with Macron and Olaf Scholz. By the same token, obviously, Draghi was very, very well kind of respected in the US. He also had a role in drafting some of the sanctions against Russia, especially as far as the freezing of the euro and dollar reserves of Russia's central bank goes. So it really helped kind of, as I was saying, reinforcing the traditional pillars of Italy's foreign policy. And also in terms of the third pillar, which is the Mediterranean one, linking this to kind of addressing the energy crisis and finding new kind of sources of gas, new suppliers, especially on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. The government led by Draghi was really active and was able to establish a number of very important sort of agreements which made possible to reduce the dependence on Russian gas very quickly overall. So when it came to the elections last year, as Dr. Pusić was saying, there were concerns, especially in the foreign press, among foreign kind of commentators about where the new direction of Italy's foreign policy may go. And these were mainly due to the presence of some political forces, which had been mentioned before, Lega and Forza Italia, which for different reasons had quite strong ties, especially to Russia. There was also concern about how the Italian kind of public opinion may actually keep kind of supporting Italy's firm position of support for Kiev in the long term. I would say that the government very quickly was able to dispel most of these concerns, especially as far as the transatlantic dimension goes. Meloni was very clear already in the campaign that she would kind of continue supporting Kiev, that she would side with the US. She actually seems to be willing to even strengthen relations between Rome and Washington. Political, financial, and military support for Ukraine was confirmed. And Italy also took a number of initiatives, for example, voting against the request of an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice over the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory at the UN, which were clearly also meant to kind of reassure Washington about where the government was going. And the trip that Meloni did to Kiev this week, again, the press conference, aside from kind of very domestic issues about Berlusconi, which are widely reported by Italian press, but not really interesting for the international public and not really important in terms of where the foreign policy of the country is going. Actually, the trip of Meloni was impressive in terms of how solid and firm her support for President Zelensky and Ukraine was, as well as addressing new issues like the reconstruction of Ukraine, bringing to the table the issue of a possible alliance. We don't know exactly how this is going to be framed, but between Rome and Odessa for the organization of Expo 2030. So it seems actually that on this kind of pillar, there is really a strong continuity between the two governments. And there are not really many doubts at the moment that what Italy is committed to doing about the war, which is keeping kind of its support for Kiev. Also, in terms of the Mediterranean policy, the government built on what Draghi had done. There were trips by Meloni to Tripoli and Algiers to keep kind of strengthening economic relationships with the two countries. Foreign Minister Tajani went to El Cairo to do the same with Egypt. And there is this idea, which has still to be kind of to take proper shape, but which is quite important overall, of launching a new Mattei plan for Africa, which is meant to create cooperation between Italy and African countries on an equal footing, both in terms of economic relationships, but also in terms of cooperation on security and migration, which is obviously a key issue for the government. The pillar where there have been, I wouldn't say problems, but say different sort of shades is the European one. On the one hand, I would say that Prime Minister Meloni was very clear that she wants to have a constructive dialogue with Brussels. She went to Brussels as her first foreign trip in her capacity as the Prime Minister of Italy, and this is really important. Italy's 2023 budget law is in compliance with EU rules. So she's trying to put forward this sort of narrative that there is a need for more Italy in Europe rather than more Europe in Italy. And also when she went to Poland, I think she was stressing this idea of a Europe of nations, which is clearly consistent with the sort of ideological background of the center-right conservative coalition, but overall can still rightly be framed within the European project. On the other hand, where there have been problems is at times is in relationships with some individual countries in Europe, and especially France, on issues such as migration. And again, in early February, when there was the meeting between Zelensky, Macron, and Scholz in Paris, to which Meloni wasn't invited. So this kind of bilateral relationship has been more difficult to navigate for the government. And obviously it is something to be considered because France is a key partner in Europe. Now, to conclude, having sort of outlined this sort of scenario, I would say that for the next year, the challenges in terms of Italy's foreign policy are basically two. The first one is how to keep kind of having this very constructive dialogue with Brussels, with the European Parliament elections looming, and with a number of issues such as the ratification of the European Stability Mechanism by Italy, or migration issues, which may sort of create more difficulties in this sort of dialogue. And the other issue, which is quite important, is the memorandum of understanding with China. It's not really talked about much in Italy, but this is meant to expire by the end of this year, better in March 2024, but it can sort of be notified by the end of the year. And so there we have to see exactly what the government is going to do. Meloni was originally in the electoral campaign quite skeptical about a renewal, but this is something which we are going to monitor and see what the government is going to do. And I'm going to conclude here.
Thank you very, very much. This was really very interesting. I have a few pages of questions, but I will refrain and open the floor to other participants. And then if there is time, I will also ask my questions. I just want to say on the technical aspect of this, please raise your hand electronically so that I can see it, which is easier for me. And if you can say who you are asking the question to. So I will now look at the hands. Go ahead, because if you don't, I will start asking my questions. Well, I will start at least with let's say one to start with, and it has to do with Italy's continuation or change or innovation in its policies towards the countries of the region. And by the countries of the region, I mean from Slovenia to Albania. So there is former Yugoslavia, of which 2 countries are in the European Union, and 6 countries, if we include Albania, are not in the European Union. But basically, all of the countries have had, I would say, a long history of relations, both political and economic. And Italy, of course, is very much present economically, but politically, we are not sure what the new government intentions are, or what it thinks about the region, or does it even want to deal with the region. And Italy, honestly speaking, is the big European country that's next door. So in a way, for us, it's very relevant. Who am I asking? Everybody, but let's start with Dr. Goretti. if you can answer this question. And in the meantime, I will make a list of people who raised their hands.
Yes, I'm also curious to hear what Professor Bianchini thinks about this, because he knows for sure more than I do. But what I think is that in terms of the vision of Europe that the government has, having a strong relationship with the Balkans and also kind of moving ahead with the process of accession for the 5 candidate countries is quite important in terms of broadening the scope of Europe and having countries which may have governments, as most of governments in Eastern Europe at the moment are, which are quite in line in terms of their vision of Europe with the Italian government. Again, the visit of Meloni to Poland, which was not very much talked about, but the press conference that she had with the Prime Minister of Poland was quite telling in this result. Obviously, is from the same kind of European party family, so to speak, as Meloni's party, but they were really kind of talking with one voice about the kind of Europe they want to see come forward. So I think in this respect, the government and the conference in Trieste last month was quite important in this respect. Is going to make a case for kind of speeding up the accession process. And obviously the economic ties and trade ties, especially between Italy and the Balkans, where Italy is, like in Croatia, the second partner in terms of export after Germany, are quite important. The government is quite attentive to what the business community in Italy thinks. So I guess this is, again, one of the concerns that are going to be key in the kind of policy they are going to promote toward the region. Then let's see how this approach then kind of is implemented and what kind of results and initiatives really take shape. But I think in terms of the overall approach, these two kind of ideas, like strengthening this idea of a Europe of nations, also by looking east and towards the Balkans, and kind of focusing on trade and economic issues and how to kind of strengthen relationship between Italian businesses and business and companies in the Balkans is going to be quite important.
Thank you very much. Remzi, Lani, as a follow-up. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Vesna. Thank you, Vesna, for inviting me at this meeting. Very interesting. I have a follow-up comment and question on what you said and commenting Stefano's point on the continuation of Italian Balkan policy. Actually, we have a continuation, which is good, but we have also a positive thing to mention, which is that Italy joined the Franco-German special envoys on Kosovo, Serbia. When I myself, I have been living between Tirana and Rome the last 7 years, and I follow Balkans, as you know, but I follow also Italy. When I talk to Italian officials and diplomats, I say something which I'm going to mention now, that Italy has to develop, in my opinion, an all-Balkan policy. We can commend German policies in the Balkans, but for Berlin, Balkans means Tirana, Belgrade, Sarajevo, Skopje, Pristina, and Podgorica. The feeling is that for Rome, Balkans means Tirana and Belgrade, mostly, you know. Is very much focused on this axis, and no complaints from Tirana, I have to say. We have a privileged position. But Italy is less relevant in Skopje or in Pristina or in Sarajevo. Maybe not very much. This is valid for Podgorica, but still, I believe that Italy has to build an all Balkans policy because, in my opinion, too much space was given to Germans and French. Nothing wrong. They have their weight, but Italy had the advantage of being very much economically present in the region and being seen as very much as unbiased, as a neutral country compared with other European powers or even United States. This is something that Italy has to use more, I think. And from this point of view, as Italian special envoy in Kosovo-Serbian talks, I think it's good news. And this happened during Meloni. I have to mention that this more assertive and more let's say not aggressive, but more assertive, more active Italian policy in the Balkans. I think that we see now, at least from Tirana, it's a good news. So this is, I don't know if Stefano agrees with this, because we talked also in Tirana recently, but I would like to listen his comment on this.
Thank you, Remzi. Professor Bianchini.
Okay, I can, well, Ramsey, you are in some way right when you think that there is some specific preference basically in Italy about Albania, first of all, and Serbia and Belgrade. So this old Balkan policy exists, although I have to say not necessarily, this is sometimes something that is not pursued by all the players that mark the foreign policy of Italy. You're right when you say that Italy is involved also diplomatically in this mediation between Serbia and Kosovo. But I would like to mention also that in the last 2 years, the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was able to relaunch again a set of projects, little projects, but projects about regional cooperation that involve all the countries in the region, including also the countries that are already members of the European Union, as mentioned by Vesna, that is Croatia and Slovenia. So the whole area of former Yugoslavia plus Albania, yes. And it seems to me that the other question is that despite of the fact that the government of Italy doesn't emphasize the role of the macro-regional policies, the regions are taking it seriously. And this is something that goes behind just the bilateral relation Italy-Albania, Italy-Serbia, and goes to a multi transnational relation that it seems to me is very important. This is the reason why I was surprised that during the conference in Trieste, they didn't mention it, but it is a matter of fact that regions are doing that, and there are lots of projects that are working, and not necessarily only on issues related cultural tourism or blue economy. There are also issues related migrations, for instance, and what to do with migrations, how to manage the flow of these people that are coming to Italy, yes, but also across the Balkans, and sometimes they remain in the areas or in the regions because they are isolated, and the key problem is to send them back or to integrate them. And if the problem is to integrate, is how to integrate. How to elaborate a policy that takes into consideration the skills of the migrants and the needs of the countries that are losing people, because this is one crucial point that we have to face, and this is sometimes an issue that is misunderstood or considered only a question of police in terms of police, rather than a term in terms of strategy, how to imagine the future of the country in a context that is deeply influenced by the regional context, the Mediterranean and the Balkans for Italy. These are the two main questions, and it's very important from this point of view. So I agree with Renzi, but I think that there are other issues that are moving and should be also considered from this point of view. It's not just only to be reduced to the coalitions that change very often in Italy traditionally, but it's something that is influencing the role of different players within. The foreign policy of Italy is not only the foreign policy of the government, and this is something that I would like to stress. It is the foreign policy of different players that are moving, sometimes coordinated, sometimes not. But Italy is in some way also an anarchic country, so you know it's quite difficult to coordinate all the players. But there are different players that are playing their own role from this point of view, and this should be in some way grasped, and it is not, and it's a pity for the government as well.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sacco.
Thank you, Ms. Pusić. Good evening, everybody. I have just a couple of comments to the second one, maybe then Professor Goretti can react. First comment is very personal. I am delighted to have to take part and to follow this conversation, because it's about Italy, of course, but also with a view to the upcoming regional meeting of Italian ambassadors in Slovenia, Croatia, and Western Balkan countries that will take place next Monday. Will be hosted by our embassy. So this conversation is especially inspirational to me. Before the second comment, very friendly, allow me to correct the reference by Professor Bianchini to Italy as an anarchic country. Just I would refrain in these very days from references to anarchism. But that's a joke. Second comment is a sort of attempt from me, and you will not be surprised for that, to somehow Croatianize a little bit the discussion in the sense that we have been mentioning the 6 Western Balkan countries, because of course they are not part of the European Union. But in terms of regional approach, Slovenia and Croatia are have always been key partners for Italy. But in the last 2-3 years, we have somehow upgraded and updated the relationship between Rome and Zagreb, also with a view to joint approaching the issues that you have been discussing until now, stabilization of the Western Balkan countries. We hold regular consultations at high senior official level of the 2 foreign affairs ministries. And over the last 3 years, we have had 23 high to top institutional level meetings between Italy and Croatia. There was some mutual distraction before, but I think that it's in the very national interest of Croatia to work more with Italy, also in a regional perspective, and the same goes for Italy. Mid-March, Minister Tajani will be in Zagreb, and now we have regular each year and a half meetings of the Committee of Ministers, bilateral Committee of Ministers, and we held first time last business forum that will be now regularly back to back with the committee of ministers, also with a view, I insist a lot on this, on approaching Italian Croatian companies vis-a-vis the whole region. So that was my second comment. Maybe Mr. Goretti, if you allow, could react to this one. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Goretti, would you like to say something about this? Or?
No, I think this this fact of the business forum I'd read about, it's really interesting and in line with this kind of focus on strengthening these sort of relationships, and somehow also addresses what Professor Bianchini was saying in terms of looking at foreign policy, not just in terms of government-to-government dialogue, but also facilitating some sort of interaction between different sort of actors and stakeholders. So obviously the business community is key in this respect, but there are other issues. I mean, Italy is doing an effort also in terms of cultural and public diplomacy. It's a very strong sort of tradition also in terms, for example, of missions aimed at strengthening heritage projects and so on. So these are areas, I think, where an effort could be made, and obviously not just towards accession countries, as Ambassador Sacco was saying, but first and foremost towards the two countries which are already part of the EU, so Slovenia and Croatia. Yes. So, but I think that this focus on trade especially is quite, and business more generally, investments as well, is quite important.
Thank you. Dan Joric.
Hello, good evening, and thank you very much for your great presentations to all three speakers. My question is actually, it aims at trying to understand the reservations that we see not only in Italy, but also throughout the European Union when it comes to further enlargement to the Western Balkans in general. I mean, this is such a big issue, obviously, for the region, and in particular, I think for Croatia and countries that are immediately neighbors, the immediate neighbors to the candidate countries. And it's been like a very long time that we have actually not moved on. And there is a feeling that there is a stalemate in terms of the enlargement and accession. So can you just help me to understand perhaps a little bit more about what the reservations are? You know, why on the Italian side, you know, why is Italy not much more, how would I say, proactive in terms of proposing and encouraging the EU enlargement, a change of policy in the Brussels, but also reforms in the Western Balkans? I mean, is this just some kind of a general understanding that, you know, there should be no enlargement, or is this also a result of some very specific concerns that Italy has with regards to particular countries or to the regions in general? Because we know Italy has had some particular problems or maybe issues to be resolved when it came to Austrian accession or Slovenian and Croatian in the past. So does it have that sort of reservation towards some of the countries of the region? Or is it just like more general inertia? So therefore, you know, nobody wants enlargement, so we don't do much either in this regard.
Then who would you like to address?
I don't know, whoever wishes, they
Dr. Villafranca.
Like yes.
Great, thank you.
Let me be very frank in my response. I remember when you know, there was a big debate in the former European Union before the enlargement about, you know, the need for the European Union either to deepen integration or enlarge the European Union itself. And then, of course, for many historical reasons, the right decision was taken to enlarge the European Union, but we were quite hypocritical, for instance, when it comes to Turkey. We promised Turkey to be a full member of the European Union, while for me, as a scholar, as an expert, it was obvious that Turkey would never join this European Union. And basically, there is one big point. and there is power distribution in the European Union. The most powerful European institution is the Council, and decisions by far in the Council are taken by majority, qualified majority. And the weight of each country after the Lisbon Treaty is strictly related to the population. More populated your country is, more power you have in the Council. And you will never see a country like Turkey, whose population is higher than Germany, to join a European Union. So mathematically, at least, Turkey would be more powerful than Germany. This is not something that we are going to see. When it comes to further enlargement, there is not basically this problem in terms of population weight of the country, of the countries, of the candidate countries, but there are other problems. One problem is money. Is EU budget. The EU policies should be completely reconsidered. Cohesion policy, structural funds, when all these countries, new countries, join the European Union. So one thing is money. The other thing is politics. We also promised, for obvious reasons, no need to comment on it, on the full membership of Ukraine. This is not going to happen tomorrow. We all know that. But the real question is, what kind of European Union we are really thinking of? Because my fear is that we cannot really simply enlarge the European Union the way we did in the past. When you have so different countries, when you have even today a country which is in war, Ukraine. But we really need, by considering the broader international context, to enlarge the European Union in a different way, to associate with different ways new countries into the European Union. Probably nobody remembers that, for instance, Turkey is in a custom union with the European Union. There is so much that we can do with other countries before we think of a full membership, which in some cases is not around the corner. And maybe we should be more transparent also to candidate countries and, provide different options to be closer, but without, creating too much opposition also in member states. And I want to conclude on this. Again, if you think of holding a referendum in some countries and asking people, do you agree on new enlargements? Probably we all know what the response would be, unfortunately.
Luckily, there are no referendums on that.
Well, on Turkey, if I may just add one thing.
Turkey,
on Turkey, France said, before we do it, we should hold a referendum.
No, I agree, but we had a lot of discussions here where Turkey would definitely be enlargement. Ukraine would also be enlargement, but Western Balkans, we see more as really consolidation of European territory because it's surrounded by European territory. And I think there is a difference. We understand all of this. We understand the fact that, it's really small countries and population is really small. But on the other hand, it is 6 places on the European Council. That's 6 extra seats, 6 extra vetoes, all of that is there.
Subsidies and
but as you said, there are a lot of things where you can integrate before full membership, and that. But Dragan Nikolic is, I'm sure, going to say something about that.
Good evening to all. I have a question for Dr. Goretti. It's a bit about the distribution of power that Mr. Villafranca has mentioned as well. We are expecting new European elections next year, and already there is a political preludium, one could say, and fierce lobbying, notably from the side of European Conservative EPP party, because if they want to keep all the highest position within the European institutions, they need to attract, I would say, Prime Minister Meloni and the groupation and group of parties conservatives and reformists. So it's not by chance, I think, that Ursula von der Leyen, Mr. Weber, President Metsola were in Rome having one-to-one discussions for hours with Ms. Meloni. Could you share perhaps with us from that Italian perspective some of your thoughts, how advanced or elongated those kind of discussions already have been in that political merchandise? What could be there for Ms. Meloni? Is that going to be more Italy in Europe, meaning in European institutions? Yes, that's my question, you know. So how, what's the bargaining chip of Ms. Meloni in this moment, coming from that kind of situation that so many fears have been after the election results throughout the Europe, and now that all current European leaders are going to Rome, and I would say as a journalist and senior political correspondent that Ms. Meloni in this moment is the most wanted European political bride. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I was also thinking whether to mention this in my presentation or not, but I was running short of time, so thanks for the question. I think it's complicated because I was having a look just before this seminar at the polls, and anyways, even if you factor in a very good result for Meloni's group, that's not going to tilt the balance by itself. So there is not going to be a majority just made up between the European People's Party and the European Conservatives and Reformists. So I think it needs to be larger, it needs to be broader, and then you have problems, because if you look more towards the center liberal side, this may not go down well, especially given this sort of somehow troubled relationship with France. So I'm not really sure whether that is going to materialize. 1 year is a very long time in terms of what may happen. Certainly there is some sort of open discussion on that. There was also before the election, I remember a very sort of, it looked like a very German sort of piece of news, but actually it wasn't. I think it was right after the election on the 25th of September. There was a debate in Germany between two senior members of the CDU about whether they should engage a discussion with the Meloni party and the new coalition or not, or better, whether the model of the center-right coalition in Italy could be somehow extended or not. And I think this has not been solved yet. There are huge issues on the table for Italy. I haven't mentioned this, but obviously the whole debate about how to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act in Europe is huge for Italy, especially if we go towards more sort of allowances for state subsidies, then Italy has a lot to lose in this sort of dynamic because of the budget constraints, and we obviously have less scope for state aid. So in this respect, actually, Italy needs more Europe in Italy rather than more Italy in Europe. And let's see what happens. I mean, I think it's a discussion which is going to unfold over the next year, but the caveat is, as I was saying, anyways, the European conservatives and reformists cannot by themselves replace the social democrats in a sort of coalition at the European level. So let's see what happens.
Dear colleagues, unfortunately, our time is up, although I think we could prolong this discussion. Thank you very, very much. I made some notes. What were the main points? Let me go fast through them. One is that the transatlantic relations are definitely something that Meloni government is insisting on and working on and improving. There is this concept of more Italy in Europe than Europe in Italy, although that also might be, there might be second thoughts because of the argument that was just mentioned and earlier mentioned by Dr. Villafranca and now by Dr. Goretti. In the end, it seems that only contested issue or only sort of sensitive relationship is with France, which is an interesting point. There was the third point that there is the need for grassroots diplomacy, which it seems the government has not yet addressed, but should. The fourth point, that the investment of the European Union after COVID in a way returned European Union center stage in Italy and became again very, very important for Italy. And the point important for all of us in the region that Italian economy will hold. There is also the point that in the Western Balkans region, there is definitely a need for more proactive Italian policy, and especially in the countries that are not yet members of the European Union. And finally, for me, a very, very interesting point, that foreign policy in Italy should not be viewed only as government policy, but also as policy practiced by many different actors that are continuously present. And maybe that is the foundation of continuity in Italian foreign policy. With that, Professor Bianchini, Professor Villafranca, Dr. Goretti, thank you very, very much. And dear colleagues, we'll see you next time. Ambassador Sacco, thank you for your help.
Thank you. Good evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.